Welcome back to another video lecture. In learning resources that are intended to introduce readers to the study and the interpretation of the Bible, one can easily feel overwhelmed with the several different terms and concepts that are introduced. Because of this, I want to spend some time defining and distinguishing several key terms that are related to biblical interpretation. So I start with the word interpretation. Webster's dictionary defines interpretation as, quote, the act or result of interpreting. Don't you just hate it when dictionaries define a word by another form of that word? Not super helpful. Webster's does go on to offer explanation as a synonym for the word interpretation. And I think that this understanding fits. Interpretation is not just about texts. We interpret events. We interpret weather. We interpret our behavior and that of others. In each case, the act of interpretation is an attempt to make sense, to clarify, to draw conclusions, and to make meaning out of what we have observed. You may come across another word, hermeneutics, in some of your studies. This is a fancy pants word for theory of interpretation. Hermeneutics comes from a Greek word that can mean expression, explication, or even translation. The field of modern hermeneutics studies how meaning is made from signs, whether those signs are spoken or unspoken. It seeks to clarify the process and methods of interpretation, how things like power and context impact interpretation, and so forth. Sometimes people speak of various hermeneutical approaches, which suggests specific practices of interpretation or even conclusions that result from interpretation, and oftentimes these practices have been informed, at least in part, by some of this wider theory or practice. Or at least we might say that there's some intentionality and awareness between a hermeneutical approach. So I think what's important to note is that we all interpret Scripture with some hermeneutic, some standards or practices for how to make sense out of Scripture. It is very likely, though, that not all of us are aware of that hermeneutic, or at least aren't fully aware of how it relates to general or philosophical hermeneutical theory. Another fancy word that you will most likely encounter is exegesis. As defined by one Bible dictionary, exegesis suggests a, quote, close reading of scriptural texts, explicating terms and sentences. The Greek word for exegesis, or the Greek word that we get the word exegesis, literally means to draw out. In antiquity, it often referred to the explanation of, interpretation of, or commentary on oracles or religious laws or other significant cultural narratives and events. For many, exegesis is particularly concerned with identifying the meaning of a text that would be appropriate for its historical context. I prefer, however, to understand exegesis as a close reading of a text without necessarily prioritizing its historical meaning, or at least not excluding the possibility of other meanings. Often, exegesis is contrasted with our next term, eisegesis. Eisegesis is mostly a derogative term or expression that suggests an interpreter has imposed her own meaning or her own thoughts on the biblical text. Often it is assumed that this imposition of meaning somehow distorts or even ignores the so-called original or historical meaning of the text. This view of both exegesis and eisegesis leads to what New Testament professor Brian Blunt has called textual archaeology. It sort of assumes that the text's true meaning is sealed up in words and phrases. If we use the right tools, especially tools that come from the historical critical method, it is thought we can extract the meaning. As I've pointed out in another lecture, many recent interpreters have called this assumption into question. What is more, early Christian biblical interpretation gave serious consideration to the multiple meanings of a text, many of which moved beyond the historical or literal meaning. In modern biblical interpretation, there are several different approaches that one might adopt in order to explain or explicate a word, phrase, or passage. There are, in other words, different interpretive approaches. I want to highlight three approaches, but I think it is important to say at the start that these are not mutually exclusive. Often in the process of interpretation, different approaches to interpretation overlap and inform one another. That being said, there are three broad approaches to interpretation that I think are worth clarifying and considering. First, there is what might be called a historical approach to interpretation. At its most basic level, this approach seeks to understand or place a text in its historical context. To do so, we rely on a good bit of historical reconstruction. We need to know something about the culture and the political situation of the day, or the customs or the practices, the sort of assumed meanings that a text might convey. When it comes to understanding a given Greek or Hebrew word, for example, we would try to understand how that word is used in other types of ancient writing and even elsewhere in the Bible. In all of this, the goal is to get as close as possible to how a word or a passage would have been understood by those living at the time of its writing. These people who are close to the time of writing, are what some have called a text's first hearers or its first readers. Second, there are literary approaches to interpretation. While literary approaches often include some historical consideration, they are more concerned with how texts themselves make and convey meaning. Often, literary approaches to biblical interpretation are informed by contemporary literary theory and even theories of rhetoric. So a literary approach might ask how characters are portrayed in a piece of writing and how that helps a text make meaning. For example, the Gospel of Mark contains a particular portrait of the disciples that literary critics or literary approaches to the Gospel of Mark have been able to detect has a particular purpose or helps the Gospel of Mark make its meaning in significant ways. In addition to this, we might consider in a literary approach the use of irony or other literary or stylistic devices and their intended effect upon readers or hearers. Finally, there is a theological approach to interpretation. This approach is probably the most difficult to define because it draws on both historical and literary approaches in large part. But I think at the most basic level, a theological approach is characterized by trying to account for the meaning of a passage or a text for contemporary readers. A basic question of theological approach would be, how is it that God is using these ancient texts written by and for communities very different from our own? How is God using these texts to speak and address us in the present? Theological approaches tend to be focused on explaining what this text or passage means for us today. Let me say again, I think that there is a lot of overlap in these approaches, but each has its distinct areas of focus. Finally, I wanted to clarify a few terms related to how people talk about the Bible. First, I am sure that you are all familiar with the traditional distinction between the Old and the New Testament. It is important to point out, however, that the Old Testament is an entirely Christian designation. Our Jewish brothers and sisters do not think of the Old Testament as old, right? Because they do not recognize or accept the Christian New Testament. So for them, Scripture is simply the Old Testament. Because of this, you may hear people refer instead to the Hebrew Bible, because most of what Christians identify as the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, although some of it was also written in Aramaic. Another way of referring to this body of literature that Christians call the Old Testament is the acronym Tanakh. This comes from three Hebrew words, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, which denote the three different parts of Israel's sacred writings, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. There are two other important terms related to the Tanakh, or Old Testament. First, there is the word Septuagint. Septuagint is a word that generally refers to the translation of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, into Greek from the original Hebrew and Aramaic. For the first 400 years of the Common Era or so, this translation, the Septuagint, was the primary way that early Christian authors, including the authors of the New Testament, engaged with the Tanakh, Old Testament. The Septuagint includes a number of books that were originally written in Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic like the rest of the Old Testament or Tanakh. Typically, these are referred to as apocryphal or deuterocanonical writings. These are the writings that were written after most of the books in the Tanakh Old Testament and before the New Testament was written. In contemporary Christianity, some denominations, like the Roman Catholic Church, regard these writings as scripture, as equally as authoritative as the Old and New Testaments. In Protestant Christianity, however, these writings are not regarded as canonical, though they may be of some importance for understanding ancient Judaism and early Christianity. While I am sure there are several other key terms that I could and probably should talk about, I feel that this lecture has introduced some of the most important. I hope that the lecture will make it easier and clearer for you to understand and engage other learning resources that discuss biblical interpretation. Thank you, as always, for your time and your attention.